Hello and welcome to this Masterclass video from Scandia Hus on plot finding, design and planning. So the point of this video is to give you some tips and ideas at the start of your self-build journey from initial idea all the way up to approved planning permission. As you'll see, the 3 points that we're going to talk about all feed back to each other in shaping your final design. It's worth keeping that in mind. So let's jump straight into the first point, which is finding your plot. Obviously, your plot is going to shape your final design quite considerably. So let's look at a few ways that a lot of customers will find, a few of the more popular ways that customers have found plots previously. Starting with local estate agents. So quite often estate agents will have land for sale. Exactly the same process as houses. So worth considering them, having a word with your local estate agent, seeing if they can give you a heads up if anything comes up. Similar sort of thing with local auctions. So they'll sometimes get plots of land up for auction. One thing to be wary of, obviously, with the auction is that once you buy the land, that's it. So it's worth doing your homework beforehand on that. Just giving the sort of planning background a quick check, making sure the thing that you're hoping to get planning for on there is quite likely and that it's worth the risk of taking. Replacement dwelling. This is probably the most common way that most of our customers go about building houses, because you get that peace of mind that if there's an existing dwelling on site, chances of you getting planning on there are quite strong. The only things you're going to be arguing there with the planners are the size of it and the final design. So it's quite a good basis to move forward from your project, as opposed to something like the existing land, where from that picture you can see chances of you getting planning approval in something like agricultural land, farming land, quite slim. Where this is quite good is if it's in somebody's back garden, where there's sort of precedent for people building in back gardens, or maybe an infill plot in between two houses. That's when you've got much better chance of getting approval on existing land that's not previously developed. So it's worth keeping those in mind. As I said, most customers go through one of those two options. Land finding agencies such as Plot Finder. These sort of big companies are essentially big databases for land and plots of land. Quite a good source of knowledge, even if they don't prove fruitful. Just for giving you a sort of heads up what average price of land is, how much land is going in sort of areas you're looking at. You can narrow down all your searches by region, so you can really narrow down and just pick out the plots that are going to be of importance to you. Word of mouth is always a surprise to me about how many people do find plots of land through word of mouth, where it's friends of friends, overhear somebody talking and piques your interest, and you can start a conversation through there. Quite often this is a good way to also reduce the cost of your plot of land, because you can catch it before it goes on the open market, before it goes to estate agents, and you're essentially cutting out that middleman, dealing direct with just the seller. Local councils. So local councils will update their planning websites, and they have weekly lists that they issue. Can be a sort of thankless task, because as you can imagine, the majority of people that put planning applications in are either doing it for themselves to build out, or it's as a developer to build out and take the profit from it. But this does quite often prove fruitful with customers, where people are putting a planning application in with the main intention of selling that plot, and again you can catch it before it goes to an estate agent and hopefully try and reduce those plot costs. Planning history is quite a key point to look at. So if you see a plot of land where you think this is a bit too good to be true, probably the chances are that it is. It may be a case that there's been numerous planning applications submitted previously on the plot, and they've all been refused, which is the reason that the plot's plot's value is reduced because the chances of getting planning approval on there are small. And likewise, if there is planning approved on the site, but it's only for, say, a bungalow, it's worth checking that out. Possibly there's been applications previously for chalets or two-storey dwellings that have all been refused, and the only thing that's been able to be approved is that bungalow. So worth checking that out if you know what you're looking to build or hoping to build on there. Equally, local plan policies. A lot of people will come to us and say, well, my next door neighbour has done, or my neighbour over the road has done it, so therefore I'm almost guaranteed to get planning approval. It's not always the case. As you'll see from this planning map, got an area in blue here, which is what's called inside the development boundary. So the chances of all of these people in their houses obtaining planning approval, either in their garden or infill plots, are quite high, as opposed to the people in the areas that are highlighted in green, which is allocated as countryside or in the green belt, not within the development boundary. Chances of them getting planning approval is quite slim. So it's not always the case of, oh, so-and-so over the road has got planning approval, therefore I'm guaranteed. So it's worth looking at those planning maps just as a quick pointer to see if there's any restrictions on there on your site or the site that you're looking at. So once you've sort of narrowed down a site and you think you've got one that's got potential, it's big enough for what you want, you think you can get planning for the sort of thing, the sort of size dwelling that you want on there, it's worth looking at possible site restrictions. So I've listed just a few general restrictions that we're always aware of before going on a build, starting with the access. So even if you've got really narrow access, it doesn't mean that a build isn't possible there, it just means it's going to be slightly more difficult. Could increase your build time and increase your build costs. So for example, if your site access, where you park your car, is 200 metres away from your front door, that could turn people off. And it's also a consideration when it comes to, obviously, construction. So the amount of items and materials you can get there, if they're over a certain size, is probably going to be restricted if you've got a really tight access. Linking in with that is your services, so things like your water, electric and gas. So just because there's a building on site doesn't necessarily mean you've got all of those automatically on site. It's not a deal breaker with these items because there's always a way of getting services on site, particularly like things like the water. Could be a case that you just have to trench all the way up to the mains, or you can use items, renewable systems like boreholes. So not a deal breaker, but worth considering because it can increase costs as opposed to not just having a disconnect reconnect. You're going for something a bit more fancy in there. Trees on your site can be an issue if your plot you're looking at is within an ancient woodland, or it's got tree preservation orders or conservation areas. These are quite key deterrents on your site because it means essentially you can't do any works to those trees and you've got to maintain them, make sure you stay away from them. So if you've got a lot of these trees on site, it's going to really limit your area that you can build and possibly even completely rule it out. Some trees, if you've got a lot of trees on site, you might have to have a tree report which will sort of list these trees as certain categories. Might be a case that all the trees on site are either dying or really not very good quality trees, in which case you may be able to take a few of those trees out to provide enough space for you to build your dwelling on site. Overhead cables, this is worth considering, particularly during the construction phase. If you've got electric cables, telephone lines, electric cables the main one for if you've got things like cranes on site. Obviously you don't want to be building any or swinging that crane arm anywhere near those electric cables. So again, this can limit your build, so it's worth considering those. Existing properties. So I know I said previously that existing properties are good because they almost guarantee your planning approval, or a planning approval on there. It's worth considering sort of age of that property and if there's any nasties on there. So things like asbestos. Quite often bats will be present in older properties, or if it's particularly run down, cracked roof tiles, cracks in the cladding that any creepy crawlies can get into. worth considering there as well. And finally, site topography. So cheapest way of building is if you've got a nice big open site that you can get nice access through and it's all flat. You've got a few benefits with the topography, because quite often if you've got a sloping site, it means you've got really nice views to look onto, but worth considering because it's going to increase your muck away costs, and it may have certain things like retaining walls that are worth factoring into your final build costs. So once you've really narrowed down your site, you're happy with it and you're willing to move forward, then it's time to start thinking about your design. A lot of people will have a set design style that they want to go to, and they've got a design brief. At Scandiahus, we can work with completely bespoke design. So whether you've seen a house down the road or something on the telly, or one of our sort of standard house types, it's about sitting down with yourself, going through a full design brief and working up a scheme that suits your needs, matches that design brief. We can get planning approval for it, and crucially, it fits within the budget. So it's worth thinking about those things. Some people try and design their build before they've even found the plot, which can be a false economy, because quite often your plot shape and all those restrictions that we mentioned, they can really shape your design moving forward. So it's worth just holding off a little bit, having something in mind of what you want in terms of number of bedrooms, living space, that sort of thing. But then once you've narrowed down that plot, then you can really start finalising that design. So going through the bespoke design, as you can see here, we can take it all the way from nice sketch schemes, just to give you some ideas. Because it might be a case that you've not got any strong feelings either way, and it's about pushing your boundaries to rule some things in, some things out, and go through a few different sets of schemes before we ultimately come up with something that again fits the plot, fits the budget, and we can get planning for. So we can turn those sketch schemes into nice 2D plans, and then in some occasions start producing nice coloured drawings and 3D plans to really sort of bring that to life. Some customers we have really struggle to bring a set of plans to life in terms of visualising the space, and in these instances those 3D drawings are really quite crucial, and they can be crucial for the planners to try and visualise that scheme on site for them as well. And then ultimately, obviously, turning those plans into a full build as you go further down the process. It may be a case that you find a plot that's already got planning approval on there. If you buy the plot that's got planning and you really like that planning approval, that's brilliant. Then you can move on to the next step, and we can take those plans, tailor it to suit our timber frame system, and exactly the same as with the bespoke design. Then we make that happen through produce all your drawings, nice 3D drawings, and ultimately make it happen on site. If you do buy a plot with planning, that's not to say that you have to build the approved plans drawings. You can go back to the planners to revise that scheme or come up with a completely new scheme. The fact that it's got planning approval, exactly the same as if you've got a dwelling on site, it's just a good first step in that you know that there is planning approval, and the chances of you getting something on there are very high. So once you've got your plot finalised, you've finalised your design, everything's ready to go, and start preparing your planning application. So the first question you might ask yourself is, do I need a planning consultant? We can advise you on this, and majority of applications where, if you're doing knockdown rebuild, something that's previously got planning approval on there, chances are you're not going to need a planning consultant, because it would be quite a straightforward application. The only things you're going to be arguing with the planners are things like your external materials and the size of it, which we can tailor with the drawing office and a bit of negotiation with the planners. Where planning consultants really do earn their money is if you're buying a plot of land, like we previously saw, that doesn't have a building on there, or it's quite a bit more contentious. Then they can really narrow down the local planning policies and pick out all the things that are relevant to your site and build up that picture to the planning office to make your planning approval. So it might be a case on that piece of land. It's a bit more of a risk, so you're paying a bit less. You're paying the planning consultant, but if they get that planning approval through, then they're worth their money in gold. So again, worth considering in that instance. So once you made that decision, it's time to submit your planning application. And unfortunately, it's not just a case of drawing up your plans. A bit of sweet talk with the planning office to get them on board. There's a few more items that go into your planning submission. I'm going to run through a few of the main sort of staples within that plan application. This is not an exhaustive list. It's not to say that every application does need all of these things, but it would be in a large majority of things. So starting with your planning application, alongside the planning statement, that sort of forms the bones of your planning submission. Outlines all of the essentially good points, and you're writing this story to the planning office of why you're doing it, what you're hoping to achieve, and highlighting all the good points in your scheme. Location plan is needed with every application to show sort of the extent of your land, as well as existing and proposed site plans. So the planning office want to see any existing buildings, where they are, and how the proposed relates to that. If you're taking out any trees or anything like that, that all needs to be shown on these site plans. Again, if you've got an existing house, the planning office will want to see details of those plans, because that will form, essentially, when you've got an existing house, it all comes down to the floor area and the volume of that existing, and that will feed back to your proposed house. So if you've got a certain volume and your house is near enough the same, your proposed one, chances are you're going to get planning approval, and normally councils have an allowable increase on existing dwellings, so that's why they need those existing plans, just so they can factor back, see how much bigger, if at all, your proposed plans are. Obviously, you've got your proposed plans, your floor plans, elevations, definitely. Sometimes they'll ask for sections to show things like your ridge height, finished floor levels. If you've got a sloping site, then a site section might be quite crucial. So the planning officers will want to see how your building sits on site. Does it sit on top of the existing land? Is it dug in? And how tall that ridge is going to be on site there. If you're in a built-up area, street seeing can be quite crucial to see how your proposed sits in with your neighbouring dwellings either side. Landscape schemes becoming more and more common, particularly like coloured landscape schemes show your planting, any hard landscaping, driveways, pathways, patios, just to make sure you're not essentially going to turn your site into a car park, and any harm that could do if it's particularly in a countryside setting, for example. Planning officers want an idea of what you're planning to do on there. And surveys, again, these are site specific, so things like tree surveys, energy reports, ecology surveys. If you're in a countryside setting with lots of trees, potential for creepy crawlies, chances are you're going to need these surveys. If you're in a built up area with none of these features on site, then probably not going to need these surveys. Finally, CIL forms. This stands for Community Infrastructure Levy. It's sort of like a development tax, really. We're going to go on to it in a bit more detail in a couple of slides, but there are self-build exemptions you can get on this. It's essentially, like I say, a development tax on new build. So council will charge you a certain fee for allowing your development, and that goes back into maintaining sites in that local council, maintaining roads, doctors' surgeries, all those sort of things. So the planning process itself, once you've put together all those documents, you're going to submit everything to the planning authority, and you're normally 8 weeks, a full application, it will be 8 weeks that your planning application will take to be for a decision to be made on that application. So once it's submitted to the planning office, they will acknowledge your application and come back to you with a application number and a planning officer. So you can use that application number to search for your application on the website. The planning officer, obviously, you can use that to contact them if you've got any issues with your application, want to make any changes, anything like that. Once your application is made valid, it will be sent out to consultation. So this will be anybody that has an interest on your site. So normally immediate neighbours, people like the Highways Authority, who else? Tree surgeon or council's tree officer, Historic England sometimes will be issued. All site specific for who of those authority bodies get notified of your application. They'll have 21 days statutory period to write in any comments, and it's at that time that you can start contact and negotiation with the planning officer. So if you've had a look on the website, or your agent's had a look on the website and seen that there's been a few comments on there, then you can start negotiating with the planners, see if they think that they are going to be of a concern, and then you can address those at that point. Following that, and up to the 8 weeks, then your decision will be issued. So you've got 3 outcomes for your decision. Hopefully it's going to be an approval, so you've gone through the process, keeping a mind on what you think is going to be approved at planning, or be able to be approved at planning, and then through negotiation with the planner and dealing with any comments that come on, hopefully you'll be issued with approval. Now, some people think if you get a refusal on your application, it is a sort of black mark against your site. Not always the case, and it may just be the case that there's certain things that can't be overcome within your application as currently stands. If you get issued with a refusal notice, the council will have to give you bullet points of sort of reasons for refusal that can really focus your revised application moving forwards. Provided you submit a new application within 12 months, you get a free go. So you don't pay the application fee twice. You can address the points that have been raised within the refusal, and then submit the new application as a free go, dealing with those points in quite confident mood that you've dealt with those points and it's going to be approved this time. The third option is to withdraw the application. So it may be the case that through the consultation with the planning officer, they've highlighted some points of concern that can't really be dealt with as substituting, or they're not amendments to the plan. It might be a revised scheme, in which case you can withdraw that application, change the plans, get it back in, again with the free go, and again with the safe knowledge that you should be obtaining that approval because you've addressed concerns raised from the planning officer. So following your approval, it's obviously champagne popping time, all celebration. Once that approval comes through, there'll be a list of conditions attached to that. A few of the more common conditions, again, a lot of these will be site specific. But almost always the council wants to see details of your external materials, whether that be photos or physical samples, just to make sure you're not going to put bright pink luminous render on the side of your house, just to sign them off. If you've had to submit things like tree surveys in there, there'll be a tree protection plan and a sort of conclusion and recommendations within that plan. And the council will want to see that you're taking on board those things during the construction phase, and that will be conditioned that you do sort of tree protection bits and pieces on there. Removal of permitted development rights is a very common application. It's normally a case where you're building something that is quite a bit larger than any existing condition on site. So they don't want you to get an approval and then you've still got all of your permitted development rights, which is you can do like side extensions, rear extensions, loft conversions, porches. It's not to say you can't do those things, it just means that you've got to go back through the council as a full planning application to get those things approved. So just gives the council a bit more control, that you can't just get something smaller approved and then do all of these sort of tack-ons and build a much, much larger dwelling. And then finally, it's starting within 3 years. So once your application is approved, you've got a 3-year ticking clock to start things on site. Now, some people will just essentially make a start on the foundations, and then once you've done that and something that constitutes a start, then you have that planning permission for perpetuity then. So it gives you a bit of breathing room if it's something you're not looking at implementing straight away. Just a little bit about the SIL now, just to sort of finish off. So alongside your planning approval, you will probably get a letter through from the Community Infrastructure Levy office about the liability, so it'll have the charge listed. Now you do get these self-build exemptions that you apply for, and there's a few little rules within that. For example, you've got to build the house and live in it for 3 years to ratify that exemption, and you've got to submit things like a self-build exemption form and a commencement notice. So it's just something to be aware of because it's a fairly new system. So it's, yeah, like I say, something to keep in the mind's eye when you do get that planning approval. That it's just something that's got to be dealt with alongside your next steps when you're specifying your final specification, going through your build costs and your build route. They're the sort of things that you've got to keep an eye on, your conditions and the Community Infrastructure Levy bits and pieces. So I hope that sort of overview has given you a nice few ideas and tips about how to go about starting your build process. If you have any further questions at all, the team at Scandia Hus will be more than happy to help. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching.